Today we're dealing with a spicy one. We're going to be talking about abortion. Now, abortion is one of those topics where Christians have been told for forever to keep their Bible out of a conversation that many of them seem to think that Scripture has no place in. Well, what I'm actually going to say is that no, we're not going to keep the Bible out of the conversation. And ultimately, I'm going to tell you that if you're against abortion and you don't come at it from the Christian worldview, you have got no grounding for actually being against abortion. Now, I think it is by God's common grace that you recognize that abortion is evil and that it is wrong, but you do not have any actual grounding to establish that fact. Now, the argument often goes that you cannot impose your religious beliefs on a pluralistic society, that if you want to be taken seriously, you need to make a secular case. Says who? I reject that, and you should reject that too, because the secular case can't give a true justification and can't give a true grounding for why abortion is wrong. And I want to push back in that framing, and I'm going to attempt to do so in this video. Now, God is not a supplementary argument that you need to bring in after, say, for example, science or philosophy has done all the heavy lifting in the abortion debate. No, God is the very reason in the first place that killing an innocent life, a human being, is wrong in the first place. If you strip the theistic foundation out of the moral argument against abortion, you're left building on sinking sand because your claim cannot actually support the weight of what you're trying to establish. You've got no foundation because you either didn't build upon the foundation or you ripped it out and rejected it. Now, you can use science to establish what the unborn is. You can use philosophy to expose the incoherence of your opposition's arguments. But the reason that any of it even matters in the first place morally is the reason that that humanity of the unborn is a result of being made in the image of God. That's the very fact of it, because as human beings, we are made in the image of God. We bear the imago Dei. Now, the image of God is not contingent upon our size or location or environment or development. Sled. It's an argument gets used a lot. It's very good. Nor is our being made in the image of God based upon the preferences of those around us. Someone who is bigger than us, stronger than us, more powerful than us, they don't get to determine that someone is more human or less human because they dislike them. That's the same argument that I'm going to apply to the unborn. So, whenever we look at science, we look at philosophy, and we look at scripture, we're going to use all three of these, but we are not going to, at least I'm not going to, pretend that they are all three independent pillars that hold equal weight of why abortion is wrong. Scripture is the foundation, it is the load bearing framework. Without it, your science and your philosophy, yeah, I think you can come to the right conclusions, and I think many secular anti-abortion advocates do come to the right conclusion, but they have no grounding for why they hold that conclusion. So, let's look at the biblical and theological case first. Now, the biblical case against abortion is pretty much what I've already said, but I'm going to get into it in a little bit more detail. Overall, the biblical case doesn't rely on a single proof text or, some sort of, minorly implied position. It doesn't require elaborate exegetical gymnastics either to construct the argument. It emerges just from the simple, plain, fundamental claims that the Bible makes about the nature of human beings and their relationship to God. Those claims then have implications that run straight through the abortion debate that completely wrecks it. We are made in the image of God. Genesis chapter 1, 26 to 27 establishes that foundational category because God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Humans alone out of creation bear the image of God. It's not a capacity that we develop over time. It's not a function of our cognitive complexity or neurological development. It's not anything to do with us being self aware or any other property that you can have varying degrees of. It is a status that is conferred completely by grace on human beings because God made them in his image. Now, whenever you look at that relationship between God and his creation, you see that in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, we can draw very explicit reasoning for why the taking of human life is wrong. Because it says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed. For God made man in his own image. So why is the taking of human life wrong? Because man, humanity, bears the image of God. Okay? So what's the logical conclusion there? For taking a human life, your life should be taken in result. Why? Because of the sanctity and the dignity of human life, because we were made in the image of the Creator. To attack the unborn, then, in the womb of all places, which is meant to be the location where they are safest during their most dependent stages, has become one of the most unsafe places in the world. Think about that. An attack on innocent, defenseless little children. But ultimately, it's an attack upon God. So, the idea that you can destroy a human being simply because you weren't responsible, you think you don't have enough money to raise it, all these excuses of, oh, I would just be bringing it into a damaged world. Well, problem is you did bring that child into a fallen world. You made that choice. You now have to be responsible and look after your child. This is what human beings have been doing for centuries. It's not hard. But the simple fact is, people will try and bring up cases like, "Oh, what about rape? What about this, that, and the other?" Those cases make up such a minority of the cases, percentage wise. They are abysmally low, and even in the case of rape, killing an innocent child because you suffered a horrendous offense, and it is a horrendous offense, does not give you the right to do an evil, a wrong, a violation like you experienced, but a violation on this small little innocent child that has no say either. That doesn't make sense. It's wrong and it's evil. Now, let's go back to this biblical argument, right? So the principle then that applies to human beings as such, that as a member of our human species in whom the image is present, the science actually establishes beyond reasonable dispute that a human organism formed at fertilization is a human being precisely at the moment of conception. Now, the New Testament, people think the New Testament doesn't really have anything to say on abortion. It does, but more importantly, what we're going to look at is James chapter 3 verse 9, and the grounds on the prohibition on cursing humans. It's it's the same principle. To even curse a human being with the tongue that we bless our Lord and Father with, and then with it we go and curse people who are made in the likeness of God, that is a direct assault on God. That is a direct degrading of a human being. How much worse then would it be to kill a child in the womb? This is the point. If you don't have the biblical basis, you have got no grounding for why this child holds value. It holds value because it's an image bearer of God. Because the personhood of the unborn is something that is witnessed in Scripture throughout. The biblical witness on the personhood of the unborn is not just limited to general principles about the image of God, but there are several specific texts that address the unborn directly in ways that are not only theologically significant, but have been consistently under-engaged in popular discussions of the topic. So in Psalm 139, 13 to 16, one of the most commonly cited, and to be honest, needs to be more common passages, is this idea that David writes, "You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Think about what is being said there. That child has been knitted together in its mother's womb. It has personhood from its very conception. Long before it lives out any days, the days in God's book were written for them, when as yet there were none of them. So you mean to tell me then that God, who knows his creation and knows when it is that we have value, when we have life, is what is often said, that he says that it's in the womb, that it's at conception. Folks, the language here that is used is remarkable, and it goes in several directions all at once, because the same God who formed David in the womb is the God that David addresses throughout the psalm as his creator, his sustainer. The continuity of personal identity between the person of David and him as the unborn child in the womb is just assumed throughout. There is no suggestion that being in the womb was some sort of pre-personal biological precursor um, that would eventually emerge at birth. That idea is not present in Scripture. God's knowledge of David, God's purposeful formation of David, God's ordering of David's days, all of this is presented as operative from the moment of formation in the womb. The phrase "your eyes saw my unformed substance" refers in the Hebrew to the golem, the embryonic form. And God's knowledge and purposeful engagement with that form is presented as one of a personal nature, of relational from the beginning. Why? Because it's a stage of development of humanity. It doesn't go from not being human to being human at a point in time. It is human from conception. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5 takes it even further. And by the way, the passage that I just cited, well, that's recorded to David. That's not unique to David. God knows that about all of us. But you have David recording it of his own life. And here again, now, like I said, in Jeremiah 1 5, you've got this that takes it further. It says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So again, that is specifically talking about Jeremiah, but the principle applies. God's knowledge of Jeremiah, God's purposes for Jeremiah, predate even the formation in the womb. The person God is addressing when he speaks to the adult prophet Jeremiah is continuous with the person that was formed in the womb, with the purpose that was ordained for them before formation. The unborn Jeremiah is not a biological process that will eventually produce a person, like I already said. He is a person in whom God's purposes are already operative. In Luke chapter 1, 39 to 44, you've got a New Testament text that, as I said, is very overlooked. When Mary is pregnant with Jesus and she visits Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John, Luke records that when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, the baby leapt in her womb and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. The word Luke uses for the baby there in the Greek is brephos, and it's the same word used in Luke 2:12 and 2:16 for the newborn Jesus in the manger. Luke uses identical language for the unborn John in Elizabeth's womb and for the newborn Jesus in Bethlehem. Folks, this is what has been brought to us. Luke, who himself, by the way, was a physician, who would have been familiar with the various ancient theories of fetal development and ensoulment. And by the way, folks, those things were conversations during the time, so don't try this anachronistic, they had no clue. They most certainly did. He uses the same word for both and attributes it to the unborn. He attributes to the unborn John in the womb the response of leaping for joy. And that's being presented as not only spiritually significant, but also an idea that challenges our concepts of what babies are capable of and what they can know and feel. Then in Exodus 21, verses 22 to 25, it's a passage that gets contested a lot, and we have to be careful with how we treat it because it can be misread. But the passage describes a situation in which men are fighting and they strike a pregnant woman so that her children come out. Reading of this passage in much of the English speaking world has treated the coming out of the children as a miscarriage. So the idea that people try and say here is when you look at the judgment, that it somehow implies that the loss of the unborn child carries a lesser penalty than the loss of the mother, therefore implying a lesser status for the unborn. However, this reading has been used by some to argue that the Old Testament itself does not treat the unborn as having full person. So, what people will normally say is that the judgment that's put upon the man clearly shows that the child being passed is not of equal value. But the problem with that is that that reading rests on a translation and a translation decision at that. And by the way, it's not even one that is the most natural reading of the Hebrew, and it is disputed by a significant number of Old Testament scholars. Because the simple thing is, the Hebrew verb used for what happens to the children that pass, that come, is a yatsa. Again, probably butchering the pronunciation of that, forgive me, but it's the standard word for live birth throughout the Old Testament. So it's not talking about a miscarriage, it's actually saying causing the children to come forth, i.e., premature birth. So that's why whenever you look at it, and you think that the punishment for the man seems to indicate that the child didn't really have any worth. No, it's talking about a child being prematurely born, and it says that if no harm is done to the mother or to the prematurely born child, then this is the judgment for what should happen to the men. So people that use this passage and try and make it ambiguous and try and say, "Oh, look, this clearly shows that there was a lesser status for the unborn," well, they're actually not understanding the text very well, and they're not interacting with the text very well, because ultimately both mother and child are treated with equal value, and that's consistent with the broader picture biblically, because you have the sanctity of innocent blood. Now, the biblical category of innocent blood runs throughout both testaments and is directly relevant to the abortion debate in ways that tend to never really get significant attention. In Proverbs chapter 6, 16 to 17, it lists shedding of innocent blood among 7 things that God hates and abhors. The prophets condemn Israel repeatedly for the shedding of innocent blood, a charge connected to the worship of Molech, the Canaanite deity, to whom children were sacrificed. In Jeremiah 19:4, it indicts Israel because they have filled the place with the blood of innocents and have built high places to Baal to burn their sons in the fire and burnt offerings to Baal, including their daughters. So the connection between child sacrifice and the shedding of innocent blood is explicit, it's prophetic, and the condemnation of it from the biblical paradigm is fierce. The category of innocent blood is not a peripheral concern in biblical ethics. It is one of the central concerns of the prophetic tradition, and it grounds a moral obligation that is non negotiable within the biblical framework. The unborn human being, on any honest reading of the biblical evidence, is the most paradigmatic case of innocent blood that could be imagined. And the industrial scale on which blood is shed in today's day and age with abortion is something that the prophets would have recognized immediately and condemned I honestly believe condemned even in stronger terms than they did in their own day. Now, let's look at the scientific case. So with the theological foundation established, the science now gets to do something specific and important. It establishes what the unborn is, confirming what Scripture already affirms about the continuity of personal identity and the point of being formed. The science cannot tell you that the unborn has moral worth. That conclusion requires the theological foundation. That's why I said Without it, you have got no grounding. You can rightly say, yeah, that the unborn is human, don't kill it. But what's your grounding for that? Because science isn't going to give you a moral framework. Now, what the science can and does is establish that the entity whose moral worth the theology affirms is a distinct living human organism from the point of fertilization, and that it is not a claim on just religious premises alone. So, fertilization produces a genetically distinct human with a complete and unique human genome built from the genetics of both parents, coding for the human being that will develop continuously through every subsequent stage of life, if it's not interrupted by murder, which abortion is. So, this is the standard teaching of embryology, and it is stated plainly in the major embryology textbooks used in secular medical education. Keith Moore's The Developing Human states that a zygote is the beginning of a new human being. T.W. Sedler's Langham's Medical Embryology states that the development of a human being begins with fertilization. Ronan O'Rahilly, I think that's how I pronounce his second name, and Fabiola Miller's Human Embryology have got one of the most authoritative texts in the field. And it states that fertilization is the critical landmark because, under ordinary circumstances, a new genetically distinct human is formed. Folks, these are not theologians. These are embryologists writing a standard medical textbooks in which they say that the beginning of a human life is at fertilization. And they make those claims without qualification. The significance for this, for the abortion debate, is pretty straightforward. The question of when a distinct human life begins is not a question on from which science has been silent or ambiguous on. It has a clear answer, and that answer is fertilization. The question of what moral obligations that fact generates is a philosophical and theological question, but the foundation of the biological question is settled. It begins at conception. Arguments that attempt to locate the beginning of a morally significant human life at implantation, at the development of a heartbeat, at viability, at birth, any other point after fertilization, are simply not following the science. They're following pseudoscience. They are selecting a philosophically motivated threshold, and then they are working backwards to find a biological marker that corresponds to it. So, for example, the heartbeat, which is detectable at around 6 weeks of gestation, is one of the most common thresholds proposed in political and legal context. It has an intuitive appeal, but it cannot bear the philosophical weight that is placed upon it. For example, the cardiovascular system begins developing earlier than 6 weeks, and the electrical activity that produces what is measured as a heartbeat begins before a fully formed heart is present. Even more fundamentally, the presence or absence of a heartbeat is not a criterion we apply to moral worth in any other context. A person whose heart has stopped temporarily during surgery does not thereby lose their moral status. The heartbeat is a biological marker of a living organism, and the organism is alive as a human before the heartbeat is detectable. Selecting it as the threshold for when moral status or a policy decision that is being dressed up as scientific is nonsense. It's quite literally subjective, and it's often being put there arbitrarily. Viability, the capacity to survive outside the womb with medical assistance, is another commonly proposed threshold, and it is perhaps the most philosophically confused one of all the options because it makes the moral worth of a human dependent on the state of medical technology available in a particular time and place. A fetus that would have been considered non viable in 1970 would be viable today because of advances in neonatal medicine. The human being has not changed, the technology has changed. It is extraordinarily difficult to construct a coherent moral framework of the current state of the neonatal intensive care unit, and the fact that viability is routinely invoked as a threshold in legal and ethical discussions of abortion reveals how little philosophical work has actually been done on the foundations of the debate. So let's look at the philosophical case. You've got the biblical foundation and the scientific evidence in place. So now the philosophical task is to expose the arguments for abortion as philosophically inadequate, to show that they cannot bear the weight of the conclusions that they are asked to support, and to demonstrate that the moral framework that flows from the biblical and scientific picture is far more coherent and far more consistent than any alternative on offer. You've got the personhood distinction. The most common philosophical move made by defenders of abortion is to concede biological humanity of the unborn while denying its personhood. On this view, being biologically human is not sufficient for moral status. What matters is personhood, defined in terms of some set of capacities or properties that the unborn does not yet possess, like self awareness, rationality, the capacity for relationships, sentience, or some combination of all these things. The unborn is human in the biological sense, but not yet a person in the morally relevant sense. So it is a personhood, not a biological human, that generates the right to life. These are the things that they try and put forth. But this argument has been developed in sophisticated forms by philosophers including Michael Tooley, Peter Singer, Marianne Warren, and they argue it with a level of rigor, but ultimately what they more do is they just dismiss the evidence. All of this has serious problems, and it becomes apparent when the implications are traced consistently. So, for example, the first problem is that personhood criteria being proposed are invariably stipulated rather than derived. Tully, in his influential paper on abortion, and I think it's on abortion and infanticide, he argues that the what he calls the entity has a right to life only if it possesses the concept of itself as a continuing subject of experiences. Then you've got Warren. He argues for a set of criteria, including consciousness, reasoning, self motivated activity, communication, I believe, is one of them. And yeah, I already said self awareness. Others in the field, they will argue for sentience as the relevant criterion. But in each case, the philosopher is simply stipulating which properties matter without providing a non circular argument for why those particular properties are the one that generate moral status rather than others. So the choice of criteria consistently tracks the desired conclusion, which is that the unborn, for them, does not have full moral status, and the suspicion that the argument is working backwards from the conclusion to the premises is very difficult to escape. Very difficult. Second and more devastating problem is that the personhood criteria, when applied consistently, generates conclusions that virtually no one accepts. Tully himself acknowledged the implication of his own argument. Newborn infants do not meet his criteria for personhood any more than a fetus does. Think about that. Newborn infants do not meet his criteria for personhood any more than fetuses do. And therefore, infanticide is not morally different than abortion. Yet we have advocates of that very position today, based on the works of men like this. Peter Singer likewise has made the same argument openly and consistently to his credit. He follows his logic, where it leads to his. He follows his logic right through to his conclusion, even though it is one that you should reject and run from because infanticide is clearly a moral evil. Now, for him, it's permissible because of his subjective criteria of what makes it a child a person. If we were to say this, if the person argument proves too much, if it proves that newborns are severely cognitively disabled, well then disabled adults also lack relevant properties that make them human, that give them human dignity and worth. Therefore, they lack the right to life. And again, unfortunately, you've got advocates that are like, yeah, those are people that should be euthanized. So Whenever we look at the case for abortion, whenever we look at the arguments that these people use, they have subjective criterion that, if were logically and consistently applied, would apply also to newborn babies up until an arbitrary age, where they again implement criteria to say, yeah, that child clearly is now showing sentience. If you remove it to a handicapped child, a handicapped adult, an elderly person that's losing their cognitive functions, they would argue that all of this would be reason to deny humanity to those people. Think about how truly evil and wicked that is. But this is what happens whenever you do not have a God who is good and just to morally ground in truth. Because then you've got the bodily autonomy argument. The bodily autonomy argument is currently the dominant philosophical defense of abortion. It's popular in both academic and just regular back and forth discourse like we're having here. It has been given some of its most rigorous defense by Judith Jarvis Thompson. She had a paper called A Defense of Abortion, and in it she essentially argues that what's the best way to put this? She basically grants, for the sake of argument, that a fetus is a person with a right to life from the moment of conception, which is a significant concession given that most defenders of abortion deny this. But here's where things go south. She then argues that even granting full personhood to the fetus, abortion can be morally justified because the right to life does not include the right to use another person's body without their consent. So her famous thought experiment asks you to imagine waking up connected to tubes to an unconscious violinist who will die if you disconnect yourself. So the Society of Music Lovers kidnapped you. They made a connection without your consent. They hooked you up to these machines and they chose you alone because you have the right body type. Thompson argues that you are not morally obligated to remain connected for 9 months, and that disconnecting yourself, even knowing the violinist will die, does not violate his right to life, because his right to life does not include a right to your body. Now, this analogy has been put into many forms and many influential forms, and many online atheists use it in different ways. But it has significant problems that, if you have even a basic grasp of philosophy, you can identify. The most fundamental problem is that the analogy is constructed to apply specifically to cases of rape. And I have to say that because if YouTube just removed the G, where the pregnancy was imposed without consent. Thompson even acknowledges this in herself in the paper. The vast majority of abortions do not occur in cases of rape. They occur in circumstances where pregnancy resulted from consensual activity, which means the dependency was not imposed the way the violinist dependency was imposed in her analogy. When two people engage in an act that they know carries the possibility of producing new human life, a new human being, the relationship between that new human life and the people who produced it is not analogous to the relationship that she proposes in her analogy of the kidnap and the violinist. So the pregnancy in the ordinary case is not an external imposition. It's the natural result of a voluntary act that both parties knew was capable of producing and consented to. The response that contraception was used and therefore consent to pregnancy was withheld also doesn't rescue the analogy, because the relevant question is not whether pregnancy was desired, but whether the act that produced the pregnancy was chosen. So driving a car while sober and with a seatbelt is a voluntary act, even if you did not consent to the possibility of an accident. So the relevant question then for moral responsibility is not whether you desired every possible outcome of your voluntary action, but whether you voluntarily performed the action from which the outcome resulted. The second problem with bodily autonomy argument is that it proves too much in a different direction. If the right to bodily autonomy is strong enough to justify the intentional unaliving of another human being who is dependent on your body for survival, it is difficult to explain then why it does not justify a much wider range of actions that virtually everyone regards as morally impermissible. A parent whose infant is completely dependent on them for survival and who would die without them, without their active provision, their nutrition, their care, cannot justify abandoning that infant to death on the grounds of bodily autonomy. Because the law and common moral intuition both recognize the dependency of relationship that is created by bringing a new human being into existence generates parental obligations that the right to autonomy does not override. The unborn child's dependency on the mother or the father is different in degree, but not categorically different in kind from the newborn's dependency on its parents. And if dependency does not defeat the obligation to the newborn, it is difficult to see why it even defeats the obligation to the unborn. It doesn't follow. Third, and in my opinion, the most fundamental, Thompson's argument, even its most sophisticated form, establishes at most that that a mother is not morally obligated to sustain the life of her unborn child. It does not establish that she is morally permitted to have that child killed. I said the wrong word again. Dang it. There is a difference between declining to provide life sustaining assistance and actively unaliving. That difference is morally significant, greatly so. Even if we granted everything Thompson claims about bodily autonomy, what would follow is that a mother might be permitted to have the fetus removed from her body, not that she is permitted to have it unalived. The fact that removal at early stages of pregnancy currently results in death because the fetus cannot survive outside the womb is a contingent fact about current medical technology. Therefore, it is not a logical entailment of the bodily autonomy argument. As neonatal medicine advances and the threshold of viability decreases, the gap between the removal and the unaliving becomes more significant, and the bodily autonomy argument becomes progressively less capable of justifying abortion rather than removal. Now, obviously, I do not advocate for removal, but it's to show that Thompson's argument can't even provide a grounds. No serious philosophical treatment of the abortion debate can avoid engaging in an argument that was developed by a guy called Don Marquis. Now, in 1989, he wrote a paper called "Why Abortion is Immoral." It was published in the Journal of Philosophy, and in it, Marquis, who is a secular philosopher, by the way, he does not ground his argument in theology because obviously he does not believe, but his paper is widely acknowledged even by the defenders of abortion as one of the strongest philosophical cases against it. Marquis begins from the question of what makes unaliving an adult human wrong, a question that most ethical discussions of abortion advocates skip over in their rush to establish a position. His answer is that unaliving an adult human being is wrong primarily because it deprives the victim of their future, of all experiences, activities, projects, relationships, and enjoyments that would otherwise have constituted the remainder of their life. He calls this the future like ours argument. The wrongness of unaliving is not located in the pain it causes, since painless killing is still wrong. It is not located in the violation of the victim's current desires, since unaliving a person in a dreamless sleep is still wrong, even though they have no current desires at the moment of being unalived. It is located in the deprivation of a future that had genuine value. If this account of what makes unaliving wrong is correct, which I would push back on, I think there's better reasons, but from a secular philosopher, sure, Marquis argues carefully that it is more defensible than the alternatives, than abortion. He understands that it is presumptively seriously wrong for the exact same reason that unaliving an adult is seriously wrong. The unborn human has a future like ours, hence the name of the argument he coined. Has the same kind of future that you have, a trajectory of experiences, relationships, projects that will unfold through the course of human life. Unaliving it deprives it of that future in precisely the way that unaliving an adult deprives the adult of their future. So the fact that the organism, so to speak, is not currently aware or anticipating that future does not change the moral weight of the deprivation any more than the dreamless sleeper's lack of current anticipation makes killing them less wrong. Marquise's argument has been criticized from multiple directions, and he has responded to those criticisms in subsequent papers pretty well, I might add too, even if I don't agree with him fully. The most common objection is that his argument would also make contraception wrong, since contraception also presents a future like ours from coming into existence. Now, Marquise would respond by distinguishing between preventing a future from existing and depriving an existing entity its future. Now, again, I would have disagreements here, and I would argue that in a different video. But again, contraception from Marquise's paradigm prevents the formation of a new human. Abortion is the unaliving of a human that already exists, that already has a future to be deprived of. So, in one sense, his distinction is both coherent, and the objector's uh, rebuttal of him doesn't really follow. Let's respond to the hard cases. Any serious treatment of the abortion debate has to engage with cases that are designed to make the pro life position seem cruel or unreasonable. And we need to do so with honesty. We also need to do so with compassion. Now, pregnancies that result from rape represent a genuine moral tragedy and deserve to be treated as such rather than as a debating point. The woman who is pregnant as a result of rape has suffered a profound violation, and her situation demands compassion rather than being used, like I said, as a debating point. However, this is what abortion advocates love to do. They love to throw out the minority cases to appeal to the human heartstrings. So, that being said, the philosophical question of whether the humanity and moral worth of the child conceived in rape is diminished by the circumstances of its conception is a question that I think is very obvious. It does not remove the child's value or moral worth. Two wrongs do not make a right. The child did not commit the act that brought it into existence. The child's humanity and the image of God it bears are not contingent on the circumstances of its conception, any more than any other human being's dignity is contingent on the circumstances of their birth. I had no say in my parents conceiving me. Doesn't give me any more or less value. I am a human not as a result of my birth. I am a human as a result of being made in the image of God. Likewise, executing an innocent person for a crime they did not commit is not a morally coherent response to a tragedy, even when the tragedy is severe. The compassionate result, therefore, or response, I should say, to rape is to prosecute the rapist, and in my opinion, the death penalty, which I believe is biblical, and to recognize that that child conceived in that act, however terrible the circumstances, is an innocent human being whose life has the same value and dignity as any other pregnancies, resulting even, say, for example, incest, which is another thing that's brought up, or something that would involve maybe coercion or abuse rather than consent. These are all tragedies, but they do not negate the life of the child that is brought into existence. The same analysis it applies across the board. The child's humanity and moral worth are not diminished by the circumstances of its conceptions, and these cases need to be treated with compassion. But that also likewise entails the abortion advocates not weaponizing these cases, which they do, because what they want to do is they want to provide a loophole and say, well, if abortion is morally permissible in these cases, then it's morally permissible across the board. But the thing is, it's not morally permissible, because even in those cases of great evil, the child is not responsible for it. Now, does not make these cases unimportant, but it is relevant to the whole policy debate, because these arguments that are built around, the hard cases, they're routinely used to justify a practice that, to be honest, is child sacrifice. People also go on and talk about the life of the mother. Very rare, medically speaking, that the life of the mother is in danger. Cases in which a continuing pregnancy poses a genuine threat to the life of the mother are cases that most directly challenge a categorical prohibition on all interventions that result in fetal death. But here's the thing: The Christian tradition has developed the principle of double effect to address these cases. An action that has both a good effect and a bad effect may be permissible if the good effect is the direct intention. The bad effect is not the means by which the good effect is achieved, and there is a proportionate reason for accepting the bad effect. So, on this principle, medical interventions that are directed at treating a life threatening condition in the mother that result in the unfortunate unaliving of the fetus as an unintended consequence are not morally equivalent to the direct practice of abortion. So, intentionally unaliving the child to spare the mother. So the cases there where it is the positive, the good case where the outcome is bad. So the mother is treated for a life threatening condition and unfortunately the child is miscarried. That is not abortion. So the most important thing now to establish in all of this, in this argumentation, is the distinction between direct abortion, which is the intentional unaliving of the unborn child as an end or as a means to an end, and the medical interventions that are directed at saving the mother's life that result, unfortunately, in the tragic and unintended consequence of fetal death. Ectopic pregnancy, for example, in which the embryo implants in the fallopian tube and cannot survive regardless of any intervention, is not resolved by abortion in the sense of the intentional unaliving of the child. It is resolved by the surgical intervention to address a life threatening medical emergency in which the embryo will die regardless of whether the intervention occurs or not. These cases are genuinely tragic and they do not fit neatly into political and legal categories, but they do not constitute a philosophical justification for elective abortion in the vast majority of cases where no such threat to maternal life exists. So, those people that run around in bad faith saying that ectopic pregnancies are the same as abortion, you are insulting and doing great harm to mothers who have genuinely lost children through ectopic pregnancies, mothers who wanted their child, and you're running around comparing it to abortion, which is the intentional unaliving. How dare you? For example, let's look at fetal abnormality. I don't want this video to go too much longer, even though it's a huge topic. Prenatal diagnoses of fetal abnormality, including conditions that are incompatible with life outside the womb, are among the most painful situations any family can face. There's no denying that. And doctors and spiritual authorities need to be involved in those decisions. They need to be treated with great pastoral sensitivity. But the philosophical question of whether a fetal diagnosis of abnormality diminishes the moral worth of the unborn child is once again, it does not. Abnormalities does not change your humanity. The image of God is not contingent on physical or cognitive capacity. The severely disabled child born with a condition that will dramatically limit their life expectancy, their cognitive development, whatever it is, does not thereby have less moral worth than a healthy child. Same principle applies before birth. The prenatal diagnosis of a condition does not transform a human being who bears the image of God into a human being whose life may not have any worth anymore because somehow they magically don't have the image of God. So, the pastoral response to these cases involves accompanying families through profound grief and difficulty. The philosophical response is to maintain that the unborn child's humanity and moral worth are not diminished by their diagnosis, but it is granted by being made in the image of God. Anyway, folks, this has been a very big topic. There's a lot more I could say, but let me wrap things up. The case against abortion is not a case that requires you to blindly only support abortion because you think it's the Christian thing to do. There are reasons, genuine reasons, being made in the image of God, it being morally wrong, it being a tragedy to end a human life. There are scientific medical evidences that show that a child in the womb is alive, that is a distinct human being with its own genetic code. All of that shows that whenever you look at it, whenever you look at the child in the womb, that God is the very grounding of that child's human dignity. He is the reason that the image He placed in every human being from the moment of their conception onwards, and it generates a moral obligation that no argument from bodily autonomy, personhood, circumstance, or anything else, including the very dramatic and severe cases of rape and incest and all those things, they cannot override it. The science establishes what an unborn child is. It's a human being in the womb from conception. The philosophical argument exposes the incoherence of the arguments for abortion, but it is God Himself who knits human beings together in their mother's womb, who knows them before He forms them, who numbers their days before any of them come to be, who is the reason any of this matters. 60 million plus lives have been ended in the United States alone since 1973. The prophets of old knew what to call the shedding of innocent blood, and they called it exactly what it was. The church in every generation has a responsibility to do the same, with compassion for the women who have been failed by a culture that offered them abortion instead of support, but also recognizing that not all of those women are victims. Some women intentionally take the life of their children and they brag about it online. Those women are not victims, and they should be held to the full extent of the law. Now, all of this has been a lot of information. If this video has been of help to you, if it could be of help to someone you know, please send it to them. Please like, share, and subscribe. To help support the work I'm doing, Buy Me a Coffee is linked in my bio. Thank you all for your support. I love you all. Christ is King, and I will see you in the next video.
Please like, share, and subscribe to the Layman Apologist to support my treat fund.